Hi everyone. So in today's video, I'm going to do an interesting topic. This is a more explanation through evolution psychology. I'm going to go a little in depth of explaining why the collective and today's modern Muslim as a human, right? Like today in today's time, why do we have such a hard time relating to Islam? Why does it feel very constrained, or can't seem to connect to that anymore? And there's a very interesting theory that I'd like to propose today, and helping you understand the frameworks of what is going on in today's modern human being and up to our point in time today, considering our evolutionary psychology for thousands of years. I am proposing that this new era that we're entering is not only the end of Islam particularly, but sort of the idea of organized religion. Why the whole idea of this way or frameworks that we relate to the divine or God no longer seems to fit with where we are in our consciousness and our point of consciousness and evolution. So I'm going to give you a little framework to have an outlook, and then I'm going to come back and discuss some more. Exactly how breaking down that framework and really getting into the nitty-gritty and just like discussing this a little more. So I'm going to take you to my whiteboard. I'm going to show you the timeline as best as I could. This is the whiteboard and that timeline that I drew. This black line here is basically our human population, like the human being, the Homo sapien, and where we are through our history. So when we look at the first quite long period, which was 300,000 to 10,000 years ago, which is when Homo sapiens arose. And in this category here, I've broken it down, but this is obviously a whole spectrum, it's a continuum. But in the early period, which was a very long period, I had to sort of condense it to put it on this timeline, which is up to from 300 to 10,000 years ago, was a period that was characterized by what we were going to refer to as a hunter-gatherer society, or that type of genome was what we were seeing. That was the kind of epigenetics that was activated at that time. And coming to 10,000 to almost 3,000 years ago is when we see a transition in this society. It evolves into this period moving on forward, which is from the hunter-gatherer society into what we know as the agricultural or the farmer society. And then here I have put in the common era. The common era is basically when Jesus arises here. This is the common era. This is kind of what we have referenced in our timeline. And this arose in the farmer society, okay? And we had a long stretch before the Abrahamic religions actually start showing up. So like the last arc of the Abrahamic religions came really near somewhat the end of the farmer society or the farmer genome mentality. Like that was what our race was as an evolution, as a species we were doing. And right here near the end, around 610 specifically, is when we see Muhammad. So he's really near, like right at the end of this age where we see this particular form of religion arise. And then we have moving on to obviously the post-farmer or like the farmer society, and we have the industrial and just the rapid revolution of what's going on. From the 1800s to the 2000s up till now, we've seen quite a few changes and very rapid changes. So what we are here now in the 2000s and onwards, this is what we're going to be discussing. And now we are in the digital revolution. So I'm going to get back and we're going to finish discussing this. So we're back now and we're going to finish our discussion about what is exactly the early part or the very large part of Homo sapiens, because let's discuss that to get a better understanding of where we are today and what's going on. The evolution that's arising, you can say that yes, human beings, the Homo sapiens as we know them today, our DNA, our ancestors, arose 300,000 years ago. And let's take this a little deeper, because we all understand that the divine was there, from even before any of this arose. Like if you ever saw one of those evolution of time and the creation of the universe, you know that there was always the divine. So let's put this into context. So we always had a divine connection. There was always some sort of God as source that we speak to, that we are speaking about. And for a very large chunk of our human evolution, you had a different connection, which I'm going to explain to a little more in detail once I explain more about the aspects and the characteristics. So when we have the hunter-gatherer society, basically, the way they arose and the way their strengths were very different than what we saw later. They had, of course, they did not have the structure or the very rigid idea. They still did have some kind of divine. It was more intuitive. It was more direct. There was certainly no middleman, right? And then when we have the arising of, or the change, because the change is happening, they are evolving. And I want you to keep in mind that when we see this evolution, there is a transformation happening. Yes, it's a continuum, but there's a quickening happening, because at every stage now we're seeing that the transformations are happening even more rapidly, right? They are happening, and suddenly they're just like even faster. They were going and going and going, but near the end, we just see them like almost at like, lightning speed now. That's happening, the kind of transformations that we're seeing. And in order to understand the breakdown, when we see coming into from that large chunk of our DNA, of our ancestor history, switching over into the agricultural society. Now, agriculture society is very different. It required you to be like in one place. It required you to follow a specific formula, basically, how to harvest, how to grow your crop. Like, it required a very certain patterns. And from that system and, that epigenetics basically arose a lot of ideas about hierarchy, systems, rigid almost, step-by-step kind of ideas. We now start following a little more specific methods, as opposed to more intuitive or more, are like what our genetics or hunter-gatherers were used to. Now we have to follow that specific thing. And over time, the generations from the learning previous generations were very much, building brick by brick on top of the previous like laid down foundations. That's how it built. And when we come to the, even more, like once we're right in the midst of it, right? We have now the rising of kings, empires, and that's where we see now the different idea of God and human being relationship with the divine, as opposed to, the human being that had a relationship previously and now has a very different type. It's more institutionalized, as I could say. It's like more codified, right? We are now giving a little bit more. There's this earth, and the human being is now trying to really cultivate it, dominate it. And that's the essence of this human evolution at this period. We see the rise of boxed in. Our spirituality suddenly boxed into neat packets of exactly how to do it, what to do, step by step, one thing by one. What is this? Like, it's very codified now, as I explained. And you can see that arising through various religions, and specifically in the Abrahamic religions, right in the end, when we see that it has a very specific flavor, as I would like to say. It's a very specific, over the time of the farmer period, that whole, arising of religions, this one has a very specific tone and flavor. An easy word to put it is very dogmatic. We have patriarchal type of ideas. We have very hierarchy. We have very specific rule following. We have, strict rules of what is right, what is wrong. And suddenly God is not like, you and God. This is not, you and divine is not like, it's no longer like this. It's more like the divine is up there, and they have middlemen to really facilitate and really, tell you exactly how to do it. Now we can understand where the idea of this religion of Muhammad, like his arrival or his ideas came from. They were not in a vacuum. Muhammad did not invent all these societal rules of marriage or God or worship or any of that. It's really in a continuum that came, and now he's suddenly, giving you one more, and that idea came in a very specific time and place in that region. Now, I'd like to pause here and really point out, like, it seems as if God, if this is what, they're claiming, was sitting and watching for a long time. He's watching these Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago, He was kind of like waiting for them to evolve, waiting for them to come to some sort of communication, and then waiting for them to learn Arabic, right? Waiting for them to, in the Arabian Middle Peninsula, to come and finally learn Arabic. And then he shows up quite late in the game, as you might say, quite late on the last edge of this in farmer society. And now he's telling you all these bits and pieces, very particular, very, very specific to a time and place kind of situation. So that's really what God's whole plan was. And then magically he's disappeared again. It was just like he was just waiting for that one perfect time in all of this Homo sapien history to finally able to tell you that here, this is all I want you to do, and this is what I want you to do for the rest of your history and time, and then magically disappear. So this is as if what, according to this specific outlook, seems like what God was waiting for you to do. He's not going to wait for you to establish connection earlier, or whatever method that, divine interaction or communication had. He really had to wait till, that 7th century situation arose, everything particular situations arose, those specific fights arose, those specific, relatives said something, or your enemy said something, or you had a fight with your wife, then he was going to whisper in one man's ear and tell you the divine for all eternity. So moving forward, I like to explain why idea suddenly seems out of place. Because what's going on is now we are moving into, of course, post-rise of that whole kingdom priesthood era, and we're almost done with it now. We're now in the new stretch where that system seems to be we still inherited that system, so it's still lingering, but it no longer seems to fit. And what makes a lot of sense, what I would like to propose, is that our human consciousness has moved forward so rapidly that the idea of these religions was for a very specific type of society, for a very specific type of epigenetics and frameworks that were effective for that time. But now, as we are moving into this rapid transformation from the industrial to the digital revolution, we no longer are able to function, or no longer seems to satisfy actually what human beings today are looking for. What we essentially have right now is inherited this structured hierarchical religion rooted in very farmer mentality and assumptions, that we are still in that era and we are still living by those norms. And now we essentially live in a post-industrial, globalized, and an emotionally fractured world. Our soul doesn't ache for law, but for authentic connection. Our epigenetics, our human story for so long, we know we've always had the connection to the divine, but this specific idea of law and this middleman and this specific root, the specific rigid rules, no longer seems to satisfy our divine authentic connection, craving for that divine authentic connection. That's why you'll see why a lot of Muslims will tell you, that they no longer feel actually anything when they pray. It's just a bunch of actions. Why don't they actually feel like the Quran is speaking to them? There is not an authentic voice, no resonance in that spoken words or that heard words. In fact, they feel more close to the divine in silence rather than in any masjid. What happens is a lot of people, when they see you who have been very living in that fear mentality, who are very gripped in the midst of Islam, and they're still, living with their forefather inherited systems, they see you as less faithful. But what truly is happening is we are becoming more intuitively honest. Somehow, I think when you zoom out and understand the whole human story, where we are, our actual ancestors, how they survived, how they got to this point, you will see that Islam was not the whole story. There's a long, long story. We are not the descendants of just Islam. We are descendants of much longer and further back ancestry and DNA. And we have always had a divine connection. This little blip that has shown up in this last leg, Islam really essentially showed up late to the game, as you can say, is not our whole story and is not the defining moment of how we are going to live and connect to the end of most organized religions, how this is going to eventually no longer resonate, no longer connect with. Enjoyed this video, or you have any questions, comments, let me know. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Bye.